to wait for, oh, okay. We got the American thumbs up, inshallah. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. So today, we're going to do, every once in a while, I used to say once a month, but our timing is becoming more sporadic. We'll do a review of a book which we think is of use or value, inshallah. So this book, Brother Hisham gave me this book. It was interesting. It's called The Architects of Repression: How Israel and its Lobby Put Racism, Violence, and Injustice at the Center of U.S. Middle East Policy. It's a relatively small book. I will just say that there is a more eminent book on this topic which is more well known, but this is a fine book that goes over the breadth of it. The other book is by Stephen Walt and John Mersheimer, called The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. Those two are both professors of foreign policy and very eminent foreign policy professors. One of them from the University of Chicago and the other one from Harvard University. So certainly that one is one I would also recommend. This book was written by Walter Hickson. He is a retired distinguished professor of history at the University of Akron. So he is a historian, and he's written a number of books. A lot of them are about U.S. foreign policy and some of the negative impacts. So basically, to get into it, the book has an introduction, has 10 body chapters, and then a conclusion. Its aims, as the author states, is to illustrate the history of the Israel lobby in the United States and its powerful impact on the ground in Palestine and in American Middle East policy as a whole. He uses a lot of resources, but also mines a particular newsletter called the Near East Report. The Near East Report is a newsletter published by Zionist lobby that is given to every member of Congress. It sort of outlines the Israeli position on Middle East, and obviously in particular Israel and Palestine. So I'll just get right into the first chapter, is the introduction. And he says, what is the Israel lobby? And so he defines it. He said, it's the most powerful lobby acting in the interests of a foreign nation in all of American history. It is the largest component of this, and not the only component, but the largest component is a group called AIPAC, which is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. And he says that it's a powerful lobby on par with the gun lobby, the pharmaceutical lobby, and the lobby for retired people, the AARP. And it is staffed by Americans who support Israel, and it uses the resources of the people, wealthy people in the American, particular Jewish community, but at large, to enforce a political orthodoxy in Congress, on the White House, and on the media. And those are the words by a former AIPAC member. This is what he said, what is the purpose of AIPAC? Its purpose is to make sure no one in power, position of power, deviates from the Israel line. So these are its stated aims and purposes. The lobby effects, this is just an example of how effective it is. They did a poll of people in Mexico, UK, and Canada, and then they did a poll of people in the United States. They said the majority of people in Mexico, UK, and Canada believe that Israel is occupying Palestinian territory. And he said the Americans, the majority of them believe the opposite. So just an example of how powerful that influence is on American opinion. He starts the introduction by doing this comparison, and many of you have, if you've been to a march or you've heard some speeches lately, they talk about settler colonialism, meaning that this comparison by the British project in America, which created the United States and around the world, a project of sending people from the UK to a foreign land, taking over that land, its resources, and disrupting and evicting the native people of that land, which is called settler colonialism. And he said that he gave an example of a president of the United States which should cement this relationship in your mind. And so Woodrow Wilson, who's a famous president of the United States, he was in a conversation with a rabbi, Dr. Wise, W-I-S-E, and he said that Jewish Palestine should never go back to the, and these are the words to pay attention to, should never go back to the Mohammedan Apache. And you can see the term he's using, Apache, to describe the Arab because it is the same, it brings to mind, in the American mind, their struggle. I mean, what they did to the United States, they kicked out the Apache and all the different Native American tribes from every part of this country to take their land. And he's saying this is a similar struggle in the Middle East. And this is the President of the United States. So we don't have to make this connection, as Muslims we are making some, spurious connection. This is a connection that, this is in 1918 when he made this comment. This is not new. This is right after the Balfour Declaration, which was in 1917. So it is nothing that we came up with, but rather it is the mentality that the US had, the British had when they invaded this country, and it's the same mentality that they exported to the Middle East and everywhere. So what is this kind of colonialism? It is a kind of mass migration from the original country or places and a violent removal policy of the indigenous people. Its goal is to eliminate as many of the native people, and it rarely leads to a peaceful resolution of conflict. And if you know Zionism and its policies from the beginning, its idea has always been that there's going to be this mass migration of Jews and an expulsion of all of the native people of that land. That is what, in their vision, has always been their goal and objective. And the original partition that they got from the United Nations, the British proposed it. Ben-Gurion said about that famously, the partition we will get, in the partition we will get more than we already have, although of course much less than we merit and desire. We must expel the Arabs and take their place. This was Ben-Gurion, one of the Israeli leaders. So, and he said, to go on, we will organize an advanced defense force, a superior army, which I have no doubt will be one of the best armies in the world. And I am confident we will get, through agreement and understanding with our Arab neighbors, or through some other means, that we will settle this matter. And so they constructed this militia, the Haganah, with massive UK and US assistance to become heavily militarized. So let's go to the start of American Zionism. So Zionism itself, and I don't keep all these dates in my mind, so I have all these lists. Probably if Brother Hisham was here, he could tell us from his memory. But 1885, Zionism is coined. So this is the term came in 1885. 1896, Theodor Herzl, he publishes Der Judenstaat, it's in German, calling for the creation of a Jewish state. And in 1897, the first Zionist organization is founded. Anybody know the name of this organization? I just like it because it's silly. The name is Zionist Organization. They didn't come up with anything very fancy, but that was the name of the first Zionist organization, 1897. And we have, fast forward to 1917, the Balfour Declaration. The British government unilaterally called for establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. At that time, Jews were 15% of the population of Palestine. So it was a dramatic and radical move to declare that. And of course, this was done far before World War II, when we see nowadays the Holocaust being justified as a reason for this establishment. So in 1917, we have the Balfour Declaration, but in 1918, a Zionist organization, I told you it was called Zionist Organization, they opened something in America. What do you think they called that organization? Zionist Organization in America. So ZOA, this is what they called it. And they convinced, at that time, Woodrow Wilson to put his full support behind the Balfour Declaration. It's that time when he said that statement that the Mohammedan Apache should no longer rule over Palestine, and also Armenia. He added that as well. So but at that time, we had a Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis, who was also a Zionist, and he also urged Wilson to convert all of Palestine into a Jewish state. At the same time, that was the beginning stages of Zionism. So we have in 1924 this act called the National Origins Act. It basically defined Jews as a separate Hebrew race, and it barred them from immigrating into the United States. There was a specific law banning Jews from migrating into the United States. It's in 1924. So you see, Zionism was established in the United States in 1917, and even the president supported some of its aims. But at the same time, the country was not in the mood to have 100% support of Zionism or of Jews. In fact, there are very prominent anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist, some of them obviously clearly racist. Henry Ford, famously very anti-Jewish. There's an evangelist, Gerald Smith, Catholic radio priest, Father Charles Coughlin. Anyway, it was a broad and mainstream part of the American society. But things changed after World War II, and gradually the public opinion shifted in the other direction. And the famous meeting, which is cited often, is in 1942, and it was held in the Biltmore Hotel in New York City. It was a meeting of all the major Zionists in the United States, and it was led by Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, and he called for establishing the Jewish state and encompass as much as Palestine as possible. And that was attended by Ben-Gurion and also 586 Zionists from 67 countries. So it's an often cited meeting. It's in history books, it's a very commonly cited. It's sort of the start, really, of American Zionism. Because in 1917, there was some small amount of movement, but at this time is when really they gather a lot of traction. So we also have Jewish Zionism, but we also have this phenomenon of Christian Zionism. So we see before that, the Christians, many of them were anti-Zionist or anti-Jewish. They were anti-Semitic. Many of them were, in fact, quite racist. But at this point, now we have certain preachers who are standing on the side of the Zionist movement. And let's see, there's a famous theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr, who was one of the first Protestants to lobby in the favor of Zionism. And in 1945, you see 1917, so by 1945, 76% of Americans favored allowing Jews to settle in Palestine. One of the Protestants says, Christian world must rededicate itself to the heritage it received from Judaism, the mother faith of Christianity. So they tried to tie, in the past, some of the Christian evangelists, they would, blame Jews for murdering Jesus, something which we don't believe, of course, happened, alayhi salam. But nonetheless, that would be one of the prominent themes against Jewish people in the Christian tradition. But you hear from this time on, many of them are in fact talking about the other way around. They're downplaying or not saying that anymore, but rather they're talking about Judaism being the father or the mother faith of Christianity, and this creating this link. 1946, the first Protestant Christian Zionist movement starts, American Christian Palestine Committee. And of course, this is the right place for the Israel lobby to be. At that time, 1939, U.S. had the largest amounts of Jews in the world, 5 million. By 1944, the American Zionist Emergency Council, which was one of the iterations of the Zionist organizations, had received endorsements from both political parties. So already by 1944, you see both parties supporting Zionism. Let's see. So a few things. What are the impacts of Zionism? So one thing is that we know from the start that the Zionists had initiated a series of terrorist actions and had terrorist movements, in fact, the Irgun and the Lehi and others, who were, in fact, killing not only native population. In 1948, in September, they gunned down the UN negotiator, the mediator in Jerusalem. And so the US, in essence, provided cover for these kinds of things. But one of the powers of the Israeli lobby, you see, in 1948, they gunned down the UN mediator. By 1949, January, the US is giving them $100 million in aid. And in 1952, Congress allocated $73 million to resettle Jews into Israel. World War II also helped them in one way because they got reparations from Germany. Germany paid them almost $1 billion to resettle Jews or for Israel to use as they needed. So they gained quite a bit of money after World War II. And by 1952, the Israel lobby was basically writing planks on Middle East policy for both parties. Wanted to give some examples. So it's a little bit hard to read this kind of book and review it because it's like, this happened and then he changed his mind and that was the power of the lobby. It's a little bit not that interesting. But there are a few examples where it is really illustrative of how they were influential. So Eisenhower, when he became president, he appointed a Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, one of the most famous secretaries of state. And initially, Eisenhower, under Dulles, withheld millions of dollars from Israel. And he later had to release them in response to the lobby. But just to give you a few things of what Dulles was up to. His brother, Alan, with the CIA, created American Friends of the Middle East to try to counteract the Zionist lobby. This was part of what he was trying to do. And he also, Dulles proposed Project Alpha, which was one of the earliest kind of peace plans. And he basically, this project wasn't very, beneficial to Palestinians, but it said that they would take in some refugees, so 75,000 of 800,000, back into what would be the border of Israel, and develop a border corridor between Jordan and Egypt. So one other thing that was unique about Project Alpha. End Arab boycotts, and then give financial incentives to both Arabs and Israelis to accept this plan. Of course, the Zionists rejected this plan and it went nowhere. But you see what happened after or during this time. The president is trying to withhold money, and we find Ariel Sharon leading a party to massacre 69 Palestinians in Gibeah. We find that Israelis launch a terrorist attack in Egypt. It was a false flag operation. They tried to make it look like the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, was attacking American and British targets, but in fact it was easily sort of captured. Egyptian intelligence caught the people doing it. It was obviously Israeli agents, and no one disputed that it was their own false flag operation. And in February 1955, they invaded Gaza, which was at that time controlled by Egyptians, killing 39 Egyptians. The results of the lobby during that time, in December 1957, they totally rejected the refugee issue. They laid claim to Jerusalem. They held on to 1949 boundaries. So the UN mandate originally partitioned 55% of the land was given to the Israelis. But when the Zionists started armed kind of occupation, they took 77% of the land. And so they were able to hold on to that during this time under Eisenhower, a relatively hostile president to them. They still kept the boundaries. They carried out this aggression with Egypt, which I just mentioned, and all the while the US continued unabated their financial support and military support of Israel. So if you think about it, this is one of the most, anti-Israeli, from the Israeli perspective, president, but all of the things that they needed were still accomplished. And in fact, they were very frustrated. So Dulles, he said that the pressure of the Jew, this is Dulles himself saying this, was causing a very nasty situation on Capitol Hill and influencing media coverage. So what happened is when Eisenhower would try to do something, suddenly they would have negative media against him, and they would be complaining to all the congressmen from both parties. So Dulles found it very frustrating to do anything. And Eisenhower himself said, except for Israel, we could form a viable policy in this area, meaning the Middle East. Around the same time, you also had media, which Hollywood became more important, 1950s. In 1956, there was this movie, The Ten Commandments, and the story of Moses. And then in 1960, there was a movie called Exodus, and the lead role was by Paul Newman. And those people who know Paul Newman, he was like Hollywood's #1 actor at one point, basically. And he led this main role. And the movie itself showed a narrative of Israeli innocence and self-defense. And they showed how innocent the Israelis were and how it didn't show anything about Palestinians being kicked out or any of the things that happened to them. So these kinds of media is going on at the same time. We have campaigns against Congress. We also have Hollywood movies, and we have multi-layers of effort to promote the Israeli side. So eventually the lobby was forced to restructure because of tax reasons. So we had, they were basically operating as a foreign lobby, and there was some tax implications. There were some laws that were passed, so they had to reorganize. So in August 1959 is when AIPAC was formed. It reorganized the lobby into AIPAC. And so from then, the structure is pretty much set for the Israeli lobby. The Israeli government, it communicates policy goals and fundraising goals and organization of fundraising with a few organizations. One is there's a conference of presidents of major American Jewish organizations. And then there's AIPAC. And they get their marching orders from the Israeli government, and then they go to work. And AIPAC, one of their jobs is to monitor every member of Congress. You know, everything about that member, their biography, how they're voting, whatever they're saying, all of these things. And you know, another aspect of this is that some of the administration, even the presidents, have special advisors that are from the Zionists. So Kennedy, for example, he had this guy named Meyer Feldman. He's a Philadelphia businessman, and he appointed him deputy special counsel to the president. But he was nothing other than an Israeli lobbyist in the White House. So some of the presidents actually have a person stationed inside the White House as an Israeli lobbyist. And he famously got funding or approval of transfer of this, at that time, was a very sophisticated surface-to-air missile program called the Hawk surface-to-air missile program. Let me fast forward a little bit to the Nixon administration. So I like this quote from Nixon. Nixon also tried to restrain the Israeli lobby to some extent. And he said, in the Middle East, the problem is Israel. Israel's lobby is so strong that Congress is not reasonable. We have to have policies which don't allow an obsession with one state to destroy our status in the Middle East. So one of the things that, for example, John Mersheimer and Stephen Walt in their book, and in this book, you know, you could say the Israeli lobby, yes, they're strong, but America is also an imperialist state. So these are things that America would want to do anyway. And Israel sort of nudging them in a certain direction, but it's not really changing American foreign policy in a dramatic direction. But what the presidents and what they're outlining in these statements is that they could definitely have more sensible policies, if not for the influence of the lobby, and creating this kind of one-sided narrative and tying their hands in terms of some of the actions they could take. So I wouldn't say it's either or, but it is definitely, there is an impact, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So I just wanted to mention a few of the Jewish Zionists and Christian Zionists, just to give you an idea about some of the key figures and the book talks about. We talked about Rabbi Abba Silver, who was that first person who kicked off kind of American Zionism. Louis Brandeis, Supreme Court Justice. David Ben-Gurion, he was originally in the United States before he became Prime Minister of Israel. Chaim Weizmann. Rabbi Stephen Wise, that's the one who was talking to Woodrow Wilson when he was telling him that about the Mohammedan Apache. And then Isaiah Leo Kennan was a famous lawyer and journalist, and he guided AIPAC for many years. Benzion Netanyahu, the father of Netanyahu, he was a professor at Cornell University before Netanyahu became prime minister. Abraham Feinberg, a very famous Democratic fundraiser who was part of the AIPAC as well. Meyer Feldman, we already talked about, Kennedy's special counsel. And even Golda Meir, who became prime minister, she was Ukrainian origin, but she grew up in Milwaukee. Much of her early childhood was in Milwaukee. So many of these were from the United States, Jewish Zionists growing up in the United States. Christian Zionists, I mean, these are people who self-declared them as Zionists. You see the characteristic of some of these, you know. Reinhold Niebuhr, we talked about, the Protestant theologian. William King, a famous Democratic senator from Utah. And then the following presidents, they all considered themselves to be Zionists: Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Harry Truman, JFK, Lyndon B. Johnson. Truman said that he considered no limits to Jewish settlement in Israel and wanted to recognize Israel, or he did recognize Israel. So what are the methods that both Israel and the Zionist lobby uses? So obviously, Israel uses a lot of violence. I mean, from the very beginning, nobody has to tell this audience about the violence that they use to kick out the Palestinians from their land. and the continued violence to this day. One of the journalists, Ronan Bergman, says, Israel has assassinated more people than any other country in the Western world. And this is the level of violence that they have towards people. So that is one. And we saw how they tried to leverage violence, cause fake terrorism movement in Egypt to blame Muslims and create an action. It's why many people, whenever there's a Muslim, allegedly a Muslim terrorist act, we always are suspicious from the beginning, because these are not things that we have made up. In fact, they have engaged in these kind of operations to blame Muslims on a fake level and in reality to achieve their own aims. We talked about Hollywood, and one of the things that Hollywood did from the 60s and onwards was the constant evil person in movies was the Arab terrorist, And so, so this was a theme. It was not by accident, They were trying to create in the mind, what was Wilson saying, that these Muslims are no different from the Native Americans? Well, they're saying they're no different from criminals and terrorists. And what do we have today, where the defense minister of Israel says that we are after human animals? So they want to keep making in the public's mind that these people are not real people. They're not civilized people. They're not people at all. You don't have to worry about what's done to them. And so it's something that definitely is done by plan, by organization. So as far as congressional lobbying, every member in Congress has a direct handler. There was a congressman recently, he was on Twitter or something, he says, every one of us has an AIPAC guy. Did anybody see this? Yeah? You saw that? Yeah, anyway, I forgot his name. Anyway, but he was talking about, he said, and the interviewer, I think this was, what's his name? He has his own show now. Yeah, Tucker Carlson, yeah. So Tucker was interviewing him, and he said, what do you mean? Everybody has an AIPAC guy? He's like, yes, everyone has an AIPAC guy. And he said, you meet him when you come to Congress, and he's your constant companion in Congress. And you're, in the book, it talks about how Mitch McConnell, the Senate majority leader many years, a very powerful senator, he said when he first won, he won by a very small margin in Kentucky. And one of the first things he did, he went to AIPAC and said, how can I support you guys so you can support me? So it's not just that they go to them, they realize that they've created this system where everyone is looking to them to support them. And the opposite way around. Any threats to them is met by a threat that they would support your opponent. AIPAC sponsors trips to Israel. They can't do it directly, that would be a violation of their tax identity, but they do it through a foundation called the American Israel Education Foundation. And so every year they send, as many congressmen want to go to Israel, they go there. They produce this newsletter, which we already talked about, the Near East Report. So, if I'm a congressman, how do I know, how should I vote? How should I talk about Israel? You read this report, Near East Report, or you talk to your AIPAC guy, he will tell you how to behave. And after every election, this same newsletter, it publishes like photos and biographical sketches of every new representative and senator. And I mean, by itself, that's not that dramatic, but the fact that their mission is to monitor every single person, they need to know them in and out, and then they do that. And that's almost a warning to people that we are watching you. One representative, Brian Baird, he's a Democrat from Washington, he described a little bit about the calculus of the representative and their thinking about this. He said he received $200,000 from Zionist lobby. So AIPAC itself can't give you the money. It has to go through, again, it has to go through a loophole to somebody else who gives you the money, but basically they direct the expenditure. So he says that he received $200,000 for each of his campaigns. And he says, if you think about it, that's $200,000 going your way. And it's also $200,000 not going to your opponent. So it's like a $400,000 net advantage. And he says it's very big for Congress. He's not a senator, he was a congressman. That's a very big amount of money to sway any campaign. Again, it teaches representatives how to speak. So, for example, they're not supposed to say occupied territories. You know, they give them language to how to speak and tell them what to say. They also have a scoring. AIPAC has a scoring system. They tell you, you know, how good are you as a supporter of Israel, and everybody wants to have a high score. By 2019, and I'm sure there's more, there's 100,000 members of AIPAC, and they're encouraged to give $2,500 each year to congressional campaigns. And that's just one aspect of how they fund this process. I mean, in fact, if you think about it, it's a loophole. I mean, it's a giant circle, because they fund the US government to give money to Israel. Israel sends the money back here to fund more. So it's just a giant circle. They don't really need to raise that much money. And one researcher who did an in-depth study, Kirk Beattie, he said that the ability of Congress to make an independent, interest-driven decision on the Israeli-Palestine conflict is irretrievably broken, meaning that they cannot make any independent decision on that. And then, aside from AIPAC, we talked about Christian Zionism. There's an organization called Christians United for Israel, which is a Christian Zionist organization, and there's 4 million members, and they claim that they have 50 million people who support them. And another way that they act, frankly, through congressional influence, is that, which is a remarkable thing. I don't think anywhere in the world you'll find this, where the sitting president of the United States does not invite the member of a foreign country, a prime minister, to the country, and instead that person comes on their own and speaks to Congress against the President of the United States. I don't think you can find even any Western country where such a situation exists. I mean, a foreign dignitary has to require invitation from the government. If you don't give it, then they don't come. And it's a very involved diplomatic process. But in this country, you know, regularly the Netanyahu is undermining the President of the United States by coming and speaking directly to Congress and outlining Israel interests. So yet another way that they undermine U.S. authority. They also want to undermine the United Nations. And Obama was speaking at AIPAC, and he knew his audience. He was trying to give them some, you know, red meat, as they say, so they would clap. And he said, "No vote at the United Nations will ever create an independent Palestinian state." And they, of course, started clapping. But, you know, the point is that Israel itself, from the very beginning, it does not want the United Nations involved in the matter. They disregarded their initial plan for Palestine, and they've disregarded every single subsequent plan after that. They've disregarded, you know, obviously now they're even facing things in the criminal court and the court for justice, all of these things. And in fact, the UN Refugee Works Organization, which supports Palestinian refugees, they've tried to get that defunded or stopped for many years. And it's not, you can see how it's all linked, because it's all linked together, that they do not want United Nations in their business at all. They don't want them to be involved. In fact, their position is that they will negotiate directly with the Palestinians, which means basically they will, you know, steal whatever they want to steal. They don't want anybody else looking at what they're doing. And so they influenced, you know, for example, Trump, he did a number of things. You know, he cut off aid to the Palestinian Authority. He withdrew support for UN Refugee Agency. He recognized Jerusalem as the capital. He recognized Israel's annexation of Golan Heights, again against the United Nations. He declared unilaterally in November 2019 that settlements are not illegal. And so all of these were kind of things that the Zionist lobby definitely wanted. Other methods, they have local councils. So every major population center has a Jewish Community Relation Council. And that council's mission is they get information from the national Zionist movements. But they work locally, and their job is to develop ties with churches, labor leaders, public officials, anybody of influence in the local population, college campuses, and they monitor and they mobilize any propaganda campaign that comes to them in an event of crisis. Of course, we talked about media and public campaigns. The Israeli government also directly involves itself many times. We talked about how Netanyahu is speaking to the joint session of Congress. But Dulles, he also complained about the Israeli government. He says, Israeli embassy activities clearly go beyond what was proper for foreign governments in that they involve domestic political action. He's saying, what are you guys doing? You're a foreign country. You're involving yourselves in our domestic political activity. So he complained to the Israeli government about that. There's a famous senator, Senator Fulbright. He has the Fulbright scholarships. You might have seen, it's named after him. A very famous senator. And he wanted to have hearings about how, where's all this money coming from? Where is it going? And he wanted to have public hearings, but they ended up being private hearings. And it led to, some changes in campaign law, but ultimately no change in their behavior. Conferences of presidents of major organizations. There's also, like I said, there's backdoor dealing, unofficial members of AIPAC. So one of the other problems from the Zionist perspective about the US government system is that the State Department is part of those career diplomats. They represent the intellectual and professional basis for any government. The State Department, I mean, you can't have any government without these kind of professional class of diplomats. And they definitely don't have, they may have some leanings, but the Zionists definitely target the State Department as one of their enemies because they don't want, an unbiased look at American foreign policy. They want their view to be superior. And so many times the State Department would complain to the president because he's having private meetings with members of AIPAC and other Israeli lobbyists as almost a shadow foreign policy team. And so this is another way that they influence American foreign policy. They undermine academic freedom. So there is an organization, we have MSA on campus, the Jews have Hillel on campus. And Hillel was much like other religious organizations in the past. It was for cultural support of Jewish students and Jewish life. But over the years, the Israelis and the Zionists, they really clamped down on Hillel. They wanted to become part of the right-wing, ultra-Orthodox Zionist extreme, and they don't want any dissent in that organization. So, example, you have Jews who are pro-Palestinian, Jewish Voice for Peace, and others, but they are not allowed to speak at Hillel meetings or Hillel organization. And so any Hillel organization that allows them, they will get suspended, they will get funding revoked, they will definitely get in trouble from the main organization. So that was one way of undermining academic freedom. They don't want students to hear different points of view, especially Jewish students. He talks about this organization called Canary Mission. Canary Mission is a very insidious kind of organization. Basically, its purpose is to try to identify any anti-Israeli individual, meaning like a professor, or a doctor, or engineer, or a student, and to take their picture and try to get them in trouble with whatever place they're working, where they're studying, and so on and so forth. This is the purpose of Canary Mission. And one of their things in academic freedom is that they want to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. So they want to link these two concepts together. What are some of the themes and motifs that they use? So these are just an example of some of the things that they would say. They compare, so oftentimes people say to Muslims, why do you don't have a right to use these, talk about Nazis. You didn't go through the Holocaust and so forth. But in fact, it's the Israelis and the Zionists who have mostly talked about comparing Muslims and Arabs to the Nazis. They're the ones who keep bringing it up. In fact, they often talk about any peace deal. They use these following words: appeasement and another Munich. And anybody know what that means? Have you heard of these things? It resonates in the American mind because before World War II, Germany took over a small portion of Czechoslovakia that was German-speaking. And the British and the French and the Italians, they got together and they said, oh, okay, we don't want war. And they cut a deal in the Munich conference. They cut a deal with, and they gave that portion to Hitler and Nazi Germany. And of course, just a few months or years later, full-blown World War II, and the Germans took all of Czechoslovakia. They didn't stop there. And so what they mean when they say this to people is that if you make any deal with these people, they will just run over us. It's like a slippery slope. It became an example in the Western mind of a weak mentality. Because Neville Chamberlain, who was the British minister who signed that deal, that forever haunted Chamberlain's legacy, that he was so weak towards the Germans in that decision. So they constantly bring up this talk. They don't need to say it. They just say appeasement. This is just appeasement. This is another Munich. They don't need to explain the whole background, but I just wanted to explain it a little bit here. They constantly, connect the Palestinian liberation struggle with Jewish annihilation. So, when the Palestinians say they want to be free, they said, oh, they mean they want to kill all of us Jews. And we're faced with annihilation. And so they constantly equate these two concepts, even though they're obviously not the same thing. They frequently complain. When one party is in power, they complain to the other party that this party is not giving us enough money, enough support. And so they try to constantly be in a position where somebody is trying to make them happy by giving them more and more things. So they constantly have increasing levels of support. They bypass and ignore the UN. I mean, we talked about that a little bit already. They really don't listen to the United States when they try to tell them to do something, and for the most part. For example, President Carter, he promised Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel at that time, he told him he's going to not talk about the 1967 borders as long as Begin promised to exercise restraint in settlement activity and military activity in South Lebanon. He said, just you back off there, I'll back off on my end. This is what President Carter said. And they agreed. And just a few months later, Begin, of course, invaded South Lebanon. So he didn't really listen. So this is a standard operating practice from Israel on its side. And also, since the time of Begin, there's been this very tight connection between the right wing and ministers. Started with a prominent evangelical called Jerry Falwell. So some of us from the 80s will remember Jerry Falwell more. But he and Begin, they developed a very close tie. And what happened is that Begin gave Falwell this very special award, Jabotinsky Award. Nobody else had gotten it before from Israel. He would take him in his private jet to Israel. Falwell would encourage thousands of his followers to go to Israel as for trips. And since then, there was this very close tie to the evangelical movement and Zionism itself, and much stronger than even before. And one of the things that happened, let me see if I can, where I put that. One of the interesting aspects of, or an example of the power of the Jewish lobby came in George Bush Sr.'s administration. So he tried to get the Zionists and Israel to agree to a peace plan, and he tried to influence them and pressure them in a number of ways. He had his famous Secretary of State, Jim Baker, and they were never satisfied with what he was up to, and in fact, right. Oh yeah, this is where I put it. Yeah. So I mean, he fought with them over resettlement funds for Soviet Jews. He told AIPAC, he went to AIPAC and he said to them to forget about Greater Israel. He said this Greater Israel, this idea in their mind where Israel will be all over the Middle East or something. So they said forget about Greater Israel. And eventually, they didn't like how he was talking to them, so they put all their support behind who? Bill Clinton. And so eventually he became a one-term president. So what people, especially the right wing, learned, and they say this is one of the lessons they learned from that election, was that we are never going to be out-Israeled, meaning that each one party is competing with the other one and who is the more supporter of Israel. And part of that is these kinds of incidents that have happened where they have lost elections and lost power because of the stance they took. And in fact, the results for the United States, and this is what Mersheim and Stephen Walt ultimately say, is a lot of negative consequences for the United States, not all positive, supporting the Israel lobby. For example, we have when Israel took over large parts of the Sinai and Egypt wanted it back, ultimately there was a 1973 Egyptian attack, which was fairly successful. The Israelis ran out of ammunition. They had to call the United States to bring them more weapons because they were basically about to lose. But subsequent to that, you had oil embargo. The Arab states had an oil embargo. The Soviet and US almost had a nuclear confrontation. The price of oil went up so high it caused stagflation in the 70s. Anybody here in the 70s, you saw that phenomenon. And so it created a great economic hardship for the United States, this kind of support. Not only that, you have during the 1980s, 2 US embassy bombings. This is all related to Israel and their activities in Lebanon. 241 Marines were killed in these bombings, 58 French soldiers. During the 1967 war, the Israelis bombed a US ship called the USS Liberty. USS Liberty was a kind of a technical ship that was monitoring off the coast of the Sinai, and they were waving American flags and so on. So it should have not been any confusion about whose ship it was. In fact, they said planes came by, Israeli planes came by several times and looked at their flag and so on and so forth. But they seemingly deliberately targeted this because they didn't want some kind of tracking or something. But anyway, so the Israelis, one of the few countries that bombed a US boat and killed 34 soldiers. Famously, the commander of the USS Liberty, he received the Medal of Honor, which was the highest military honor. I believe it was Johnson who was the president at that time. Normally the president gives the Medal of Honor to the recipients. And because he didn't want this incident to explode, he gave it to one of his lower ranked people in the State Department, or I think Department of Defense, to go and give this medal. And in fact, the details of this event was secret for many years. Kissinger at one point said, "We are giving to Israel aid at a rate which would be unbelievable for any other country." I think the estimate has been, since the creation of Israel, U.S. provided with $146 billion in aid and military defense. So all of this is to say that there is a lot of negatives for the United States with regards to their support of Israel. I'm going to end kind of the talk there just with a few quotes. One of the congressmen, Ernest Hollings, when he was retiring, he said, "You can't have an Israel policy other than what AIPAC gives you." And Thomas Friedman, the famous New York Times columnist, he once said that Ariel Sharon he had Arafat in house arrest in Ramallah at one point. He says he has him in house arrest in Ramallah, and he has George Bush in house arrest in the Oval Office. So this is what Thomas Friedman was saying. But this is just some examples of how people perceive it. So I think what you see overall, what this book is trying to demonstrate in other books on the Israeli lobby, is very clear. They have a stranglehold on Congress, for sure. For sure they have, no congressman can really vote against Israeli position. And they have very significant ways to influence the president and his actions as well. The question that still comes, though, is ultimately this, which is that would the U.S. act differently without the lobby in terms of its foreign policy? And certainly, one of the things is that Israel itself, somebody once said, if Israel didn't exist, that the U.S. would have to create Israel, because they need a colony in the Middle East to exert their power. They have colony like that in Asia. You have South Korea, we have Japan, we have their influence in South America and in Africa. And so every part of the world they want to exert an influence, and it's particular strategic importance to have that colony that is completely reliant on you, the United States, for support. And so it ensures a continuous connection and influence over the region. And so I think that's one of the valuable things for U.S. But at the same time, clearly, probably some of the presidents and sometimes the State Department would like for some of these peace initiatives to be successful, for some of these things to be solved, for these wars not to happen. These are costly, they're bad for U.S. Foreign image. After all, what's happening in Gaza is a genocide, but it's also a big stain on the U.S. image in the world. It's decreasing their influence throughout the whole world. It's decreasing one of their foreign policy objectives, which is promotion of human rights and freedom, because they cannot do that and support a genocide at the same time. So it becomes irrelevant, this kind of power projection. The U.S. doesn't project power just by military, it also does it by its values. And that kind of power projection is basically zero when you're in this kind of scenario. And in fact, the opposite is happening. They're constantly losing influence in the region. So definitely there are some negative impacts that the lobby affects the United States and does so more than any other lobby. The Forbes magazine said the two most powerful lobbies, they measured all of them in terms of influence in the United States. They said the AARP, the retirement lobby, is number one, and the second is the Israeli lobby. So, and they wouldn't spend this much money if there wasn't some benefit to them. So I just wanted to stop there. I know Isha's time is coming. Anybody had any questions or comments or anything more they wanted to add on this topic? Well, they're more weak with their position with regards to the United States, for sure. I mean, Israel, for example, will constantly refuse to listen to the State Department without any consequences, really. But other Arab countries, they would they can influence them in many different ways. So I would say that the level of loyalty is not dissimilar, but the power imbalance is quite a bit more. Other way around, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the brother was saying this again, that they have a closer tie in their religious connection between Jews and Christians. And certainly they would promote that. But I mean, there's many ways you could say Muslims have close ties to Christian as well. After all, many of their theologians, they learned a lot of their theology from Muslim theologians, and many Muslims influenced their thinking as well. So it's really how you look at it, I guess. But, yeah. Okay. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.